Okay, good morning. So we're continuing chapter 3 of Mitzvahs Haamonas Elokus. It's a Tzadik's analysis of the mitzvah to believe and know God, which we're presently discussing. So where we are is, we established already that to start, there's a mitzvah to know God. And to know God, as he explained, is not just to know the fact of God as the livingness of creation. That's something that's known by default. It's known. I experience in myself that I'm of flesh, but there's a livingness in me. So look at the world at large. I see it alive. There's a livingness to existence, to creation. The mitzvah is to think deeply about it so that it affects you emotionally. And that was where the Tzemach Tzedek spoke very beautifully about. If a person thinks deeply, he becomes a different person, and then his emotions become open, and then from there can flow all of the kinds of feelings towards Hashem, as a person really feels connected to the universal livingness of creation, which is a fancy way of saying God. From there, the Tzemach Tzedek told us that, okay, so that's one mitzvah, and that ends with that which you can understand and comprehend and know. The mitzvah to believe is that which is beyond. And that's what we're in the middle of discussing at the moment. Now, to discuss that, to get to that, the Tzemach Tzedek in this chapter introduces a discussion or dispute between those who are following Rambam's view versus, today we're going to be introduced to Maral's view and the Hasidic reconciliation between the two. So we learned last time Rambam's view, which essentially does this dance where, on the one hand, he is obviously maintaining divine oneness. That's obviously a central component. And as we learned way back, divine oneness meaning that it's not comprised of elements, but it is inherently one, as opposed to a comprised oneness, which is what everything else we know. Even if it's a single unit, it's comprised of a bunch of other things. Whereas God's oneness is absolute. And at the same time, we have the scriptures about God. We describe God as kind, wise, intelligent, strong. These are all descriptors, which, if we were to apply that in human terms, would be a bunch of components that come together to make me. My intelligence, my compassion, my kindness, my sometimes being angry, whatever, all these different things that come together to make me. So with Hashem, that's not the case, because we're looking at absolute oneness. But at the same time, we're describing God as kind and wise. How do we do all that? How do we balance that? To which the Rambam said, he introduced this idea of God being absolutely one with his intelligence. He is the known, the knower, and the intelligence all in one, right? Usually it's me, component 1, using my mind, component 2, to understand information, component 3, and for Hashem, all 3 is one. And he said, this is impossible for any human to even say it, to understand it, because it doesn't exist in our realm, knowledge that's in and of itself. Our knowledge is definitionally to know that which is outside of us. Yeah, so this is where the Rambam left us off. To maintain God's oneness, while at the same time maintaining the descriptors. In that God is absolutely one with his descriptors. Unlike us that are comprised of our descriptors. Yeah, this is where we left off. Yes? Okay. So now let's see on the right hand side where it says V'hoidulai. So first, what the Tzemach Tzedek's going to do is he's going to quote a section of Tanya, part 2, which we learned. I'm sorry, actually, it's a section of part 1, but it's repeated and explained in part 2. So we're going to be familiar with some of it, which is really the reconciliation between Rambam and Maral. And he's going to do that before he introduces Maral, as we'll see. Okay? All right. The sages of Kabbalah agreed with Rambam's contention that God is absolutely one with his attributes. Rambam speaks of it with regard to wisdom and intelligence, and Kabbalah / Chassidus applies this to all divine attributes, that he's absolutely one with his attributes as opposed to us who are comprised of our attributes. Yeah? And now here he quotes the Alter Rebbe, which is a note, like a gloss in chapter 2, part 1. Quote, so we're quoting time now. The scholars of Kabbalah agreed with him in this idea that God is absolutely one with his descriptors. as is written in a book called the Pardes by the Ramak. The Ramak stands for Moshe Cordovero. Moshe Cordovero is the teacher of the Arizal and probably the founder of the Kabbalistic school of Tzfas. When you think of Tzfas as a Kabbalistic city, there was like probably half century, maybe not a very long time, when there was like this explosion of Kabbalistic learning in Tzfas, and one of the leaders, if not the leader and founder, is the Ramak Moshe Cordovero, who amongst his works is a work called the Pardes. And there he says that we accept Rambam's contention that God is absolutely one with his descriptors. Continues the Alter Rebbe. The Gam Lefi Kabbalas Arizal Tziva Milsa. Even according to the Arizal, the Rambam's contention works. And just to explain briefly why it would be unique to say that even according to the Arizal it works. Because Ramak was the first one to properly articulate the idea of divine sphirot, the divine attributes being light and vessels, if you will. The light and vessel analogy, which we spoke about once, how the light retains its absolute oneness while the vessel changes. Meaning if you have multiple vessels, the light still remains one singular projection. Yeah, that was... Ramak speaks about that idea. Now, the Arizal was the one who introduced the idea of the Tzimtzum. Now, the Tzimtzum means that the Tzimtzum means God, there's infinite light, and then the infinite light contracts to create space. Now, what that means is that God's essence is beyond being invested in vessels. It's not even ever invested in vessels. It's beyond the contraction. There's a level of God that's beyond being limited. Which would mean, you would think, that Arizal is rejecting Rambam's notion, because he would put God beyond the Tzimtzum. Right? Whereas... Which is beyond description, whereas the Rambam is giving description, but description with absolute oneness, whatever, but still description. Right? So you would think that Arizal might reject Rambam, considering that he puts...
Contraction.
Because contraction implies that God's essence is beyond any definition, which is why you have contraction. The reason why you have a Tzimtzum is because there's God beyond any definition, infinite, so you got to contract to make space for finite. Whereas Rambam is giving description, God as being one with his... In other words, God being one with his attributes only exists post a Tzimtzum world. In a pre-Tzimtzum God, there is no attributes to God for God to become one with. Right? Because he's beyond definition, which is why you had a Tzimtzum.
But isn't that what you said?
Sorry?
When we went through it, you
Yes.
said that the attributes only really exist once there was a Tzimtzum.
And I got it from right here.
Okay.
This is where it comes from. Yeah.
So you're saying...
Why you would
the
think
Arizal-
Arizal would reject it because he has this idea of Tzimtzum, to which the Alter is going to say in a minute that Rambam applies post Tzimtzum, but not that Arizal is rejecting Rambam. Yeah? Following? Is that clear? Mm-hmm. So let's see. So also, according to the Arizal's Kabbalah, it stands. We can accept Rambam's contention. When we think with regard to the mystery of God's investment, through the various different tzimtzumim, containments, once we come to the idea of God contracting himself and investing himself in the vessels of Atzilus, then we can apply Rambam's contention that God is one with his attributes. But not beyond Atzilus. Beyond the world of Atzilus, where it's beyond tzimtzum, just God, light, undefined, without kelim, without vessels, then we will reject Rambam, so to speak. Right? As explained elsewhere, this is still the Alter speaking in Tanya. That the infinite one, that the infinite essence of Hashem is way beyond, infinitely beyond, the very notions and the very conceptions of intelligence, Chachma, Bina, and Das. To the point that in relation to the divine essence, the notion of intelligence is equal to his distance with physical matter. So in the same way we look at God's infinite and we say God's infinite is beyond any of the physical definitions that we have here, that same equal distance exists between God's essence and divine intelligence, even divine intelligence. This is something we're going to explore soon, but this notion that once you hit infinite, it doesn't make a difference how big the thing you're comparing it to is, it's equally distant. Infinite is not closer to 1 billion than it is to 1. The distance between 1 and infinite is the same distance between 1 billion and infinite. It's the same distance, even though 1 and 1 billion are going to be 1 billion apart. right? So likewise, once you talk about Hashem beyond the tzimtzum, beyond contraction, he's beyond any definition, he's infinite, his distance to divine intelligence is the same distance as it is to physical, because it's infinite, it's beyond. Right? Only once Hashem chooses to contract himself and invest himself within the vessels of Atzilus, now we can say that God is one with his intelligence as per Rambam. This is what the Alter Rebbe is basically saying. So we already have a reconciliation to Maral's position, that God is beyond definition, and Rambam's definition that God is one with his intelligence, by saying, well, you're talking about different levels. Divine essence, Maral, beyond definition. Rambam, once you get to Hashem choosing to contract himself within definition, now we have applied Rambam's standard that God is absolutely one, even within his definitions of intelligence and so on. You clear? Yeah? So we're kind of foreshadowing already, because the Tzemach Tzedek first gave us a solution before he introduced Maral. You clear? Yeah? Okay, let's go forward then.
There's still like going to be that gap, that infinite gap.
That's the tzimtzum. That's precisely the point of the tzimtzum. The tzimtzum is that infinite gap.
Right.
Where Hashem says, I'm containing my infinite and allowing now a finitude. And in that finitude, I'm going to be absolutely one there too, as per Rambam, one with my intelligence. But that's the infinite gap right there. Right? That's why the tzimtzum is such a huge idea to grapple with, because it's like the bridge between the infinite and the finite.
All the streams of, like, we talk about the Arizal and the Rambam and the Rashi, does everybody agree that there was a tzimtzum?
That's a good question. At this post Arizal world, pretty much everybody agrees there was a tzimtzum. There were certainly, I don't think they still exist, maybe they do, but there certainly were strains of Kabbalah that did not accept it. Yeah, ironically, they felt that the notion of tzimtzum is too corporeal. It's too materialistic to say that God takes a space and then removes from a space. Right? But in so doing, they're back to, quote, the problem of just Rambam, where God begins at definition. Right? He begins at being one with all these definitions. Oneness, granted, but still definition, which is going to be Maral's problem. So that's why there's a constant dance. We're keeping God no definition, but at the same time, you're kind, you're wise, you're this, you're that. So what are we saying? Right? So Rambam is saying, well, no problem. No descriptions are part of his oneness. And Maral, we're going to see in a moment, says, what do you mean? But that's description. To which Arizal, the way the Alter Rebbe is framing it, is, well, yes, there's the divine essence that's beyond description, and then God chooses to manifest in definition. And when he does, it becomes one with his definitions. Yeah? So that's the foreshadow. Okay. So, fourth paragraph. Ad kan l'shanoi b'hagah b'lokut amor m'chelak aleph perek beis. End quote of the Alter Rebbe in Tanya, part 1, chapter 2. The Herek Bazan is more at length. Chelik beis perek tes in part 2, chapter 9, which we learned a while back. Okay. So having foreshadowed to the conclusion, that Tzemach Tzedek now backs up to introduce to us the problem with the Rambam's position, as articulated by Maral. Ubeira, to explain this reconciliation that the Alter Rebbe is offering, that the Rambam only applies to a post-Tzimtzum Atzilus world, post-contraction when God invests in definition in the world of Atzilus. So to explain that, and therefore we'll understand what it means when he says that beyond Atzilus, Hashem is beyond definition. Tahainu, meaning to say, that beyond Atzilus, you can't even describe God as he is being absolutely one with his knowledge. If so, what is there to be said about this beyond? If we cannot even say that he's one with his intelligence. Even him being one with his intelligence, Rambam conceded is impossible to say. So what do you describe for that which is even beyond that? What could you possibly say? If we can't even describe properly what that means, that God is one with his intelligence, what could we say about him beyond that? What do we have?
So what does the Rambam say? Like, what's his conclusion?
That's where it
How do
starts.
you reconcile?
God's absolutely one with his intelligence, period. Doesn't add any more.
And how does he explain all the descriptors of Hashem?
That's how he understands them. He's absolutely one with them. Because they're in and of himself. In the same way God's... Actually, the truth is, he only says it about intelligence. Al-Derba applies it to other attributes also. When it comes to the other attributes, Rambam actually goes, we remember learning this a while back, where Rambam actually says that the other scriptures are just the way he projects the creation, not his essence. But he does describe his intelligence as part of his essence. That he doesn't deny his oneness, because he's absolutely one with his intelligence, but still he puts that as part of his very descriptive self.
He doesn't see it as two different levels. He just talks about one.
Yeah.
basic.
That's a good point. I wonder if Rambam would reject the whole notion of levels.
Yeah.
He might reject the entire notion of levels entirely. Yeah, it's possible. Have to think more about that. But I think so.
Like, doesn't he say, like, chesed, kindness, is not the way we see kindness?
It's projection to
just,
creation.
It's just like for us to understand it, you know?
Yes,
like,
he does say
like,
that.
You can't really fully understand God. It's just like...
Yeah, but one of the challenges to Rambam is like, okay, you're okay saying God's one with his intelligence, why can't he be one with his kindness? Like, that's a projection, but his intelligence is not. Like, why are you so hung up on God being one with his intelligence? Either all projection or he one with all. Right? Which in a way, Chassidus accepts all of that. That all of it's only projection, because God is beyond definition. He just chooses to be these definitions. But once he chooses those definitions, he's absolutely one with them as the way you describe intelligence. Follow that, someone? Okay, so let's see now. Okay, so let's now read Maharal's words. Hine now. Hagoyin HaMakubal, the great scholar and Kabbalist, Rabbi Yehuda Loi ben Rabbi Betzalel Prague, otherwise known as the Maharal of Prague. Yehuda Loi, son of Rabbi Betzalel. Rabbi Shel Tosfos Yom Tif, teacher of the Tosfos Yom Tif, one of the classic commentaries in the Mishnah. So he, the Maharal, Bakta Masa L'Sifra Gvuras Hashem, in his introduction to the book called Gvuras Hashem, he writes, His sigma oid al das ha'omrim u'matara moisei shu yadei v'adeya. He strongly opposes those who want to describe God as the ultimate intelligence, who's absolutely one with his intelligent being. He's the knower, the known, and so on. And he is elaborate in responding to them and refuting their position from all kinds of angles. V'amar, and the Maharal writes, and here we quote. Now Maharal's talking. Re'eh, consider the fact. Shehem Amim Olav, they say about God, Shatz Musai, that God's essence, Seichel Mufshat, is an abstract, intelligent being. Now, V'chol Seichel, any intelligence, U'sheyedea hadavar b'nafshay, kamoshi chutz l'nafshay. The very definition of intelligence is that which someone knows something inside of himself concerning that which exists outside of himself. That's the definition of intelligence. He'll address Rambam's oneness conception in a moment. Bim kain, if so, hu yisparach nismach al asher alul mimenu. If God is described as an intelligent being, and intelligence means to know that which is outside of you, that would mean God's dependent, his existence is dependent on that which he made. Because what does he know? He knows those things he made. He is an intelligent being, which knows things he made. So his existence is dependent on that which he made. That's circle. You follow the problem?
Like we heard this before.
Before we get to Rambam's idea of oneness with intelligence, just think of God as a regular intelligence. Right? If you just thought of God as an abstract, regular intelligence, abstract in the sense that it's not in the body, it's abstract. Which, by the way, putting Rambam aside, others do believe God is that way. Intelligent design. Right? What is God? The intelligent designer. Now, if God is the intelligent designer, this is what Maharal is saying, that means his very essential definition is the intelligence about what? About that which he created. So his whole beingness is dependent on that which he creates. So what's creation dependent on? On him. And he's dependent on what? On creation? You can't make him dependent on that which is dependent on him.
Why is this a component in order to get to know God, though?
No, well, it depends how you whoa, back up. How do you define God? That's the question here. No, this is not a condition. It's not a question of condition to believe in God or not. It's a question of how you define and understand God. Right? So Rambam gave us one definition. Maharal gave us another. Ready? What's the definition here? There are those who want to understand God as the grand intelligence, the grand abstract intelligence. Maharal is rejecting that idea because that would mean that his inherent being is dependent on that which he creates. Because intelligence means to know that which is outside of him. The only thing outside of him is the things he created. So he's dependent on that which he creates, which in turn is dependent on him. It's circle. It wouldn't follow. That's his problem.
But why why do we say there is a dependence? Like, he's just inferring that there is a dependence.
Well,
What if
because,
there
okay,
is no dependence?
given the definition that intelligence is to know that which is outside of you, that means, let me put it this way, my intelligence is conditioned to the fact that there's information outside that I know.
It doesn't mean
Otherwise-
my intelligence depends on knowing what
Well,
there being.
if there is no information outside of me to know, there is no intelligence in my mind. None. It doesn't exist. Its whole definition is
I
to,
mean, it gets the effect of.
but that's the definition. It's a functionary. So unless it can function, it doesn't have a definition. The definition of intelligence is to acquire info. If there is no info to acquire, there is no intelligence. Again, if that's the definition of intelligence. Even if the definition of intelligence is to analyze, you still have to have something to analyze. Otherwise, what's your intelligence? Right? So, which means God's definition, if God were to be the intelligent being, is dependent on him knowing that which he creates. Well, let's put it this way. What is intelligent design prior to creation? What is it? The plan for creation? That means that already implies a creation existing. Before even a plan to exist, what's this what is God? You cannot describe him then as an intelligent being, because there's nothing to be intelligent about. Which means the very notion of describing God as an intelligent being only exists once creation exists. So his definition is dependent on creation that he creates. That's circular. That's Maral's arguing. Right? Try to envision God as an intelligent being without any creation whatsoever, without even the notion of creation. How do you describe him as an intelligent being now?
You can't do that.
Exactly.
It's very finite. But once creation's already done, from our perspective, like
Okay, so then the definition of him being intelligent being is not a truly definition of him.
right, it's not.
Then that's what you just acknowledge. That only the notion of God being intelligent about creation only exists after creation. Then that's not him.
Why do we have to define God as an intelligent being?
He's rejecting that, but there are those who would, and this is just he's explaining why he's rejecting that definition. Okay, before he even gets to Rambam's oneness thing, just the very idea of intelligence.
Who's this that saying? that?
Maral's speaking.
Maral.
But it's based on the Rambam saying.
He's going to get to Rambam in a
knower
second.
and the known.
Yes, he's going to get to that in a second. But first he wants to build his case. First by rejecting the idea of God being intelligent, period. In the classic sense of knowing things, knowing information, which is the general, correct, by analysis or by knowing, whatever, however you acquire information. Which again requires things to exist outside the intelligent being. Otherwise there is no intelligence. Right? We're watching artificial intelligence be created. Artificial intelligence being created is inherently dependent on the input of information given to it. It doesn't produce information on its own. It's a collator of information that is submitted to it. It does not exist without the submission of information. Right? That's why data collection is such an expensive and lucrative business. Because without data collection, you cannot create intelligence of any kind. Not AI and not Google, without first acquiring information. Because otherwise there is no intelligence. Right? So, think of this. AI cannot be the creator of the intelligence that it then imbibes to become a creator, to become an intelligent being. That's circular. The information has to first exist, and then there's a collector of the information, and now output. So, God cannot be that, because that would mean he's dependent on that which he created. Yes?
That's a good example.
Okay. So that's the second paragraph. V'im kain, if so, hu yisbarach, he may be blessed, nismach ala shel alula mimeno. He would be dependent on that which is created from him, or resulted from him. And that can't be. The ya'ol kodem ha'ila. The effect would be before the cause. The effect being creation would have to pre-exist the cause, the creator who knows about the effect. Circular. Like AI has to come after information. But if God was the grand AI of creation, it means he'd have to exist after the creation that he created. That's circular. Doesn't work. Okay. Now he introduces Rambam's definition of intelligence. Now let's say you're going to suggest that God knows himself. This is Rambam's thing. And this knowing those things is the reason for their creation. So now we're looking at a different kind of intelligence. An AI that generates its own information that it outputs. Right? So the fact that this exists is because God knows it, rather than it exists and now God knows it. Right? AI is the bottle exists, and now AI knows about it. Whereas for God, his knowing about it produces it. Because he is the knower, the known. He is all one with himself. He is the knowledge, he is the knower, and he's the known. So therefore, the things that exist only exist resulting from his knowing himself about that item. Which again, you can see how it's circular, it doesn't follow. Right? That's why he built this case, to explain why he's not buying Rambam. See? But even if we're going to say that, it says, and you're going to suggest that the intelligence, the concept, and the conceptualized are all one, which is the same thing as what Rambam is saying, the known, the knower, and the knowledge. Davar echad. You want to say it's all one. As those who are of that school of thought have elaborated to explain. And therefore the result will be, according to this view, that his knowing himself, is the reason why these things exist. Is therefore it itself, the concept and the thing that understands it. Right? So the reason for its existence is knowing it, and he himself is the known that knows it through himself, that creates it.
That's again circular.
Again circular. After all of this stuff, it becomes completely like it's completely nullified, it's completely nothing. All of this with all the fancy dancing doesn't work. Because intelligence has a specific definition, whatever definition you want to give it. As like, for example, we define intelligence as knowing things as they are. So however you want to define intelligence, even if you give this whole dance, that's all in of himself, it's still a definition called intelligence, in which is a beginning, a middle, and an end. Right? The Ein El Hashem Yisparech Geder Klal Sheyugder. And there is no definition by which you can define God, period. And if you can describe God's essence as being an intelligent being, even if you're going to do this dance of him being one with his intelligence, with that, you are giving him a definition. Therefore, therefore, you cannot say of God that he is of any defined thing, that he's specifically this entity and not something else. And therefore, it is foolish of those who say that God's essence is intelligence. But the truth is of God himself, like Tuchar, Lavar, Dover, Meyuchad, you cannot say any specific anything. So what do we say? We say it is a simple being, without any definition whatsoever. This is not an intelligent being, it's just a being, period. We do not know what this beingness and what the essence of this beingness is. Right? Sorry? Top the next page. And if we're going to say that God is not intelligence, he's not that. And certainly not, God forbid, describe him as any material being, as any physical being. So what are we going to say about him? Lehem will respond. The soul that gives you life in your body, can you identify it? Can you define it? No, you can't. So Kol Shekin, how much more so? Doubly how much more so? The creator of all. You cannot ask, what is his beingness? You just can't do it. No one can see God and live, as the verse says. Okay. And all these matters can be understood from the names that we give of God. Specifically, the essential name of God is the name Yud, the Hey, and the Vav, and the Hey. We don't pronounce that name, but the root word of that name is Havaya, which means beingness. So we don't give it a description, we just say beingness. Lilmoi, to teach us, that's his essence, just a beingness that doesn't have any description. But intelligence is not simply a being, it's a defined being. And God is beyond definition, just a being. V'sovan elo advar ma'od. Understand this very well. Ad kan l'shoneh, and quote from Maral. Okay, he's going to quote the Maral more.
I just find that this whole thing is circular and it's like a discussion with no end.
Almost.
And then so I'm trying to find out the purpose of the discussion.
Very good.
Because like there's no start and there's no beginning and it's just so.
Very good. So I'll tell you very good question. So you're asking all those questions and piling questions, and every angle is another question. So what Tzemach Tzedek's doing essentially really is saying that everybody's right. And everybody becomes right once you introduce the notion of levels, which he's going to say soon, because we're still defining God. And in Chassidus, one of the things that Chassidus introduces is not that there's God, but there's godliness. Now, once you introduce godliness, you can have levels. So you accept the premise of divine oneness. That's the whole dance of Shariach of Emunah, right? Which is that God's oneness permeates even into the lowest levels of creation. But that fact that God permeates into the lower levels of creation goes through myriad of levels, and in each level you can see God in a different light. So you start at the top, no definition. And God invests himself into definition, like Rambam, he's one with his definition. And he goes lower, he's one with creation, one with the very table, one with the very blade of grass. And that's why he's doing this whole dance to explain why each of these components are correct, but relative to where you're stationed and how you're looking at God from that perspective. Right? In other words, all this, let's just say for example, all this we're describing God as beyond definition. Does that contradict everything we said till now? God is the livingness of all creation? It doesn't. You're talking about God in his essence versus God how he chooses to manifest into creation. Right? And then how God manifests in intelligence. Right? So once you introduce the notion of levels within godliness, while at the same time we're maintaining the truth of God's absolute oneness as he permeates all these levels, now you can square away all these different levels, all these different ideas and concepts. That's kind of what he's doing here.
But how does
Follow?
this tie back to the mitzvah of believing in God?
So we're going to get there, God willing, next week. But essentially, this is the mitzvah. The mitzvah is to believe and have faith and accept the notion that God is beyond definition. Because you have nothing else to say about that. You cannot say you know it, you don't know it. You cannot say you comprehend it, you can't comprehend it. You can't even say you feel it. Because it's definitionally beyond definition. So whatever experience you have is definitionally a definition, and therefore definitionally not this. And that's the idea of faith. So the faith now doesn't become such an irrational proposition. It's actually a very rational proposition. Maral's contention that God is beyond definition is not irrational. It makes perfect sense, does it not? And yet that's the essence of faith, to accept that there's these things that you cannot accept, you cannot understand, you cannot comprehend. Right? Because we push the limits of intelligence, and we understand that God's beyond definition. So however lofty of intelligence you're giving me, even intelligence of Rambam is one with his intelligence, you're just looking at the definition, and God's beyond that. Right? So if you want, we have like 3 different levels so far. There's the God we know who's invested in creation, because we feel it. Maybe we don't comprehend it, but we know it, because we feel livingness in creation. Then there's Rambam that's, okay, God's intelligence is beyond that which I can even feel, because his intelligence is, he is the one knower with his intelligence and so on. This absolute oneness of intelligence, which I have some words for it, but I don't truly understand it. Now that itself isn't even a faith level yet, because I still have some words. And then beyond that, there's Maral, which is, one second, God's beyond any definition. Cannot say anything of it, other than just accept that it's there. Okay? Following? This is what Tzemach Tzedek is going to do for us next week. But before that, he first has to quote another section of Maral, which we'll do next week. Namely, okay, so if God's beyond any definition, how does he explain the fact that we describe God in our prayers as intelligent, as kind, as wise? How do we deal with that if it's all beyond definition? So that's all that stuff. Anything.
There's also, it says that Hashem looked into the Torah and created the world.
Yeah.
Which kind of makes you feel like there was God and Torah. And that even predates the world creation.
Excellent question. Excellent question. Excellent question.
Well, what is that?
Right. So that itself.
Part of him, and so then he's divine even before creation.
Right. So that itself tells you there's levels. Does God's invested in creation? Does God plan in creation? Does God writing Torah? These are all levels that exist. So there's a level in which Torah emerges out of God's mind, whatever that even means. A mind, which does he have or doesn't have? I don't even know. Right?
It's like
It's a lot to process. So we're going to get next week. We're going to learn from Maral how he understands God as in the descriptors. How do we understand that? Considering he just emphatically told us, which this could be our takeaway from today, understanding that whatever definition you give to God, as lofty and as grand it is not it, because it's a definition. So even if you're going to give me Rambam's dance about God being one with his definition, and therefore his definitions don't destroy his oneness, that's a choice. That's only a choice God has to manifest within definitions that don't destroy his oneness. But that's post-choice. God's essence in and of itself is beyond any definition whatsoever. It's just a beingness. That's the closest we can get to a description. A beingness. Havaya. And that, as we'll learn, that's the idea of faith. Knowing God as he's one within creation, as a life of all existence, and accepting that, in essence, it's beyond anything I experience.
It's just so amazing how our minds are so small compared to the infinity of it, of the infinity, and the fact that the rabbis were able to wrap their heads around it, and these giants are not here anymore. Anyways, it blows my mind.
So it's funny saying that there's a in Hasidus you find different angles as to what the purpose is of studying all this stuff. So sometimes it discusses it in terms of generating an emotional attachment to God, like we learned last time. You know God's presence, you can feel it, and then you do a mitzvah because you want to connect to the livingness of all life, which you spoke last time. That's one reason to learn all the stuff. And sometimes it says the reason to learn all the stuff is just to be in awe of the grandeur of truth. That in and of itself, to be in awe of the grandeur of truth, there's almost a great for humility. There's a great for humility to be able to look at it. That makes sense. Just to enjoy looking at the notion of this grand truth that's so much bigger than anything you can possibly, right? It's almost like everything else we get worried about becomes petty. It's like this little stupidity. Do you not realize how grand the world is, how grand truth is, how grand God is? You're busy with this thing. So there's a certain elevation of the spirit that comes along with appreciating this grandeur.
Looks like you were explaining on Shabbos with the Rabbi not being concerned with the worldly matters.
Exactly, because he lives in the world. Yeah, exactly. Okay, we're clear? Good? All right, so God willing, next week we'll see Maral on how he understands these descriptors, and then someone said to explain to us that's what faith is, to accept God as beyond definition. Yeah, you want to say something?
So I'm just thinking faith, you don't have to be so intelligent to have faith. Or do you?
So that's a funny thing, which...
Like you say you have to push your limits to know that everything you know, you keep saying that, but
Good question.
But at the end of the day, it's I'm gonna still have the same faith. I know that there's something I can't put definition to, I can't understand,
It's a good question. So faith does not require intelligence. But if you have intelligence, you can't ignore it. So you can't... in other words, a child just doesn't... accepts on faith just because, without too much thought before. But then you get older and you start thinking. So one way to deal with that is, oh my gosh, the thinking is ruining my faith, stop. Don't think so much, it's ruining the faith. Mm-hmm. And it's a Masadek saying, no, push it, go, see where it goes, see, push. Right? And now, you don't need intelligence to have that faith. But if you have intelligence, you have to be able to go through it to get to real faith. Otherwise, it's just, you're just shutting half of yourself down and accepting that you don't know anything, which is it leaves a whole part of you out of the equation, because I do know a lot of things, right? So to push that knowledge to be able to get to that which is truly beyond.
But if you're not guided properly, then you could lose yourself.
Oh yeah.
So there's the dichotomy of wanting to push further. It's to get to know, or to get to deny, or whatever.
So there's a word by there's a teaching. There's a saying that Hasidim say that one should never end a mimer on a question. I'll continue tomorrow, because the question percolates and the answer is not there. So and the discourse is going to answer the question, and you just stop before the answer was given, with the exception of one question. At the end of chapter, I think 4, in part 2 of Tanya, the Rebbe concludes the chapter with the question of, if so, why aren't we nullified to God? If everything's within God, why aren't we nullified? And then he ends the chapter. So that's a question you can sleep on. Like, why aren't you nullified? You can sleep on that question. But otherwise, you have to be able to go through all the way to the end. Otherwise, like Rabbi Emmanuel Shachat, of blessed memory, was a counter-missionary expert. So in his lectures, he would announce that if you don't want to stay for the whole lecture, please leave now, because I'm about to start proposing a bunch of questions that unless you stay to the end, you're going to be stuck with questions. So if you don't have another hour, please leave now. An hour later, I'll do the same announcement. Okay, I'm about to go to the next level. So if you don't want to stay for the whole hour, please leave now. Anyway. Okay. Wonderful weekend, buddy.